you accept the recording? There we go. Okay, so Barry is about to basically walk us through the way that the brain is embodied and the body is embrained. And
the body is embrained.
yeah.
Okay, never heard that one before, but that's good. The body is embrained. That's true. It's very true. In the sense that the body is represented per se in the brain. And as a matter of fact, you know, one of the things that I have fantasized about is that if we had a fine enough resolution instrument to do real time and like a holographic functional MRI, you know, if we had something like, I mean, it would take enormous computational power to do that. But if we could have and I mean, eventually it's probably going to be possible, but to have a holographic functional MRI that would show what it would show is that we would see our body, the parts of our body. It would show an image of our three-dimensional body in many various different places in the brain simultaneously. There would be caricatures because there's differential representation of different body parts, and there's a basic principle in which the more important the body region is, like particularly the fingers and the face, the more neurons there are devoted to it compared to the, say, the shin, the leg, the lower leg, which is a large part of the body, but there are relatively few neurons devoted to it. So if you look at a body map, it looks like a gnome with an enormous face and enormous fingers, but tiny legs and tiny trunk, but big hands and face and tongue, because there are many more neurons devoted to the hands, the tongue, the face than to the legs and the torso. So the actual size of the body that we would see in this hypercomputer three-dimensional holograph, there would be these gnome-like caricatures of ourselves, but they would be represented in many different regions of the brain simultaneously. And if we could do it at real time, and we did something like, say, jumping jacks, then we would see all our little selves in various different specific places in the brain, not just anywhere in the brain, but in very, very specific regions of the brain, and in different sizes. We would see our gnome-like selves doing the jumping jacks in our brain.
So we
and
have this thought experiment. Let's pretend we have the magic cap where we have perfect spatial and temporal resolution. We can see every action potential, maybe like even like within it, we could see like the spreading electrochemical activity. Not clear the granularity, but we have basically, we have the information, all of it that we want in space and time. And so then we're seeing these homunculi of different kinds.
by the way, for people who the word homunculus means a little person, and that's what I mean by the gnome, the gnome. because it's a caricature.
Genome.
Gnome, yeah, the
Okay.
gnome. It's a caricature of ourselves, and with high enough resolution, we would be able to see ourselves and make a distinct, and we would be able to see ourselves in that image. And with high enough resolution that you're talking about, we should be able to see, I should see myself and you should see yourself.
But
And I should
not
be able
any
to,
old, yeah, but not any old caricature. This, you said it's specifically like
of,
distorted or enhanced according to the importance.
right, but it would also be identifiable as you or as me with a high enough resolution.
Hmm.
You know, because our facial features would be in that gnome,
Oh,
in
so
that
you,
homunculus.
so some of
So
the geometry that actually defines us, like our body shape, and or even like the way we like the morphological, like the muscular properties of our bodies would influence the exact caricature we're dealing with. So it'd be like, what is
exactly,
the overt shape and what is the effective functional shape? And
exactly,
this would be,
exactly.
I see. So it's not just that these would actually track in real time the actual movements of the physical body.
No, it
But,
would.
well,
It would
that's what I'm
actually.
saying. It's not just that, but you're saying this would have identifiable information within it on
That's
top of
right.
that. Mhm.
That's right. I mean, it would be our. We would be a gnome out. You know, this and you know, to use a technical term, is the homunculus, which means a little person. Uh, but it's not just a little person. It's a caricature of a little person because it's all distorted in terms of an enormous hand and face and tongue and a tiny torso and legs and feet.
I
Or
wonder
the
how
actually
much
the
they
feet are a little.
vary.
What?
I wonder how much these vary at what level. So like you
Well, it
would see like
varies.
some
It
very like the spine, you might expect those homunculi to be somewhat more similar. But then like as you move up, could they really start to deviate? Like could they, how much do we vary in these?
well, uh, that is it's variable in very specific ways. It's variable in the sense that a person with an amputated arm or a person born without an arm has a different shape in the brain,
Hmm.
a physical, because more and more there are compensatory responses. So the actually it would be kind of it would look a little bizarre because for example, in the case of as Ramachandran showed, in the case of a person, a guy with an amputated hand, um, the hand was the brain is plastic to some extent, and it remodeled the sensory cortex, and now his the neurons that used to respond to the hand, of course they no longer respond to the hand, but however the since the pathway going up to the cortex, to the hand neurons in the sensory cortex, by the way, the sensory cortex is over here, that the neurons that used to respond to the hand, but since the input is gone and vacates that area, the face neurons, which are right next to it, move over. They sprout, and they then connect to the neurons that used to be in the that used to represent the hand. So now, if the guy taps his face, or if his face is tapped, he feels as if his fingers on the gone hand are being tapped. So he has, it's a phantom limb phenomenon. He feels the fingers, but there are no fingers there because the face neurons, or the neurons that projected to the face, now sprout and not only go to the face, but they also go to the adjacent hand neurons, because the hand
To
and face are represented next to each
to
other on.
what extent is that adjacency of hand and face experience dependent? Like to what extent is it like a function of early nursing? Or not nursing, early like thumb sucking? Like
It probably has an effect. It probably does. I don't know.
like you have like a
I don't know if you can see.
self-organizing like map, and it's trying to like
Yeah,
Like what you're talking about last
it
time,
can
like
adjust.
basically
Well, that's a
maximum
good question.
economy of
I
communication.
think,
And so if
you
they're
know,
like really like the hand and the face are heavily interacting, this
right.
should,
Yeah.
based
Well,
on
it
that
just,
principle,
and people
induce
who are,
adjacency.
yeah. Well, it's use or disuse, because if it's disuse, then the area degenerates. And if it's hyperuse, then it gets bigger.
I mean, look at the thalamus one. It actually even looks like an infant. It's like ready to suck its thumb.
Yeah. Well, actually, if I can somehow get out of the, oh no, if I can, oops, if I can, how do I don't see
Escape?
how to, I'm, I'm trying to escape from, oh, if I think, okay, here, let me just point this out. And I can zoom into this. Let me get this out of the way. Zoom
I mean,
into
it could be
this.
like something like
Here,
Hox
here is,
genes are genetically determining it, but I'm wondering to what extent is like the Hox genes are laying out a body plan which has like certain affordance properties, like you will bring your hand close to your face just because of the distance and the joint angles. And so then you have the rooting reflex, and so the infant would be sucking its thumb just automatically. And this is helps to establish like a reliable.
it's probably true, because it's been done. I know it's been done the opposite way of experiments where they held in hind, cut the blinded a kitten in one eye, put an eye patch over the kitten's of one eye of the kitten, and the corresponding visual cortex degenerated, because and this is a very important principle, that neural activity sustains other neurons, and without it not only do they connect with each other through synapses, but through those synapses, the activation of neuron A by the input from neuron B, the activation of neuron B by stimulating neuron A keeps neuron B alive. And if you eliminate neuron A, neuron B dies. It's called Wallarian degeneration.
So
It's well
Wallarian
known.
degeneration, in
Yeah.
terms of if your partner, by which you're basically creating neuronal ensembles or cell assemblies that can resonate or co-activate. If your
Well,
partner goes, then you're not
degen-
getting the stimulation, and then you get like apoptosis, like a default cellular death.
that's right. It's the other way. The degeneration is in the absence of the input, the neurons that if you block the eye input, then the visual cortex neurons die out, but there's other neurons take their place. So it would be very interesting to do studies on people who are, say, blind from birth, and to see whether other sensory systems expand in their neurons, in other neurons are developed to take their place, or people who are born without limbs.
It's interesting with the blind example. I know this one study that's showing that the V1 ends up responding to Braille. And so then the thing I'm wondering is it taking, I want to know more about like the details of those representations, and they're like, is it taking on the function of a kind of like somatosensory cortex on like on what level?
Well,
or is it actually more like a broad amodal association cortex, almost kind of like we were talking about earlier with respect to like Broca's area being more at the level of meaning? So like
that's an interesting
what
question.
is the function? Like at what level of abstraction does this get repurposed?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, it may be something specific to the learning of Braille. I'd have to see that study.
Which is also spatial.
But I mean, the point is, what if would tapping a finger, just tapping a finger, which we know activates the finger area of the sense. Here, I wanted to show this image before. This is the sensory cortex. You see the body map. This is by Penfield and Rasmussen. Here's the sensory cortex. This is a cross section through the cortex. Here are the different. This is the neurons of the sensory cortex, and this is where the face is represented. Neurons responding to different parts of the face. Here next to it are the neurons that respond to different fingers. That's how
Interesting
specific it
there.
is. And look at it's
Well,
and then here's the upper arm.
But interestingly, you're on like I'm looking at the motor and the sensory, and they're like
Yeah.
largely
Oh, that's the motor. It's the
corresponding.
same thing. It's
Same
the same
thing,
thing.
but there's like a slight difference, and I'm wondering like
There's
I'd
a
like
slight
I'm
one of
wondering
the
like like you'd expect like it couldn't be exactly the same, obviously. But I'd like to a little bit know more about like why is it specifically different in different areas?
it's well, for one thing, the major difference, there is a major difference that something is there in the sensory cortex, but gone, but not in the motor cortex.
It's a difference that makes a difference, I'm imagining.
It's the difference that makes the difference, and it's
Wonderful.
right here. It's right here, not shown very very clearly in this picture, but this is the genitals, right there, right next to the foot, right next to the foot are the genitals, and that's in the sensory cortex. Thank you for pointing that out. It's sensory cortex, but not in the motor cortex, because not in the motor cortex, which would be right here's the foot. So obviously there's no motor control of the genitals.
Or
So,
limited, I guess.
well, no, there's no muscular activity of the genitals.
I guess
no
I'm wondering like muscles around like the pelvic floor. Those could
Well,
be
that's
controlled.
different.
That's different.
Here's where the pelvic floor is,
Oh, wait,
because
so that's way up there, actually.
that's the pelvis. That's right, because here's the foot, and then the calf, and then the upper, and then the thigh. You see, it's systematic. That's what I mean. It's coherent. That's what makes it a map. Exactly. That's exactly the point. You think that the perineum, you think that the penis and the clitoris should be right next to the groin, but in fact they're not. That's a really important exception, because they're physically they are they're not part. They're related to this part. They're the part of this part, the pelvis, and the genitals are something specific.
I wonder like the extent to which that would change if like we had degrees of sensitivity changing at different points in development. So like there's almost like like the Freudian like latency period, but like just the idea though of like until like you get like engorgement and like turgidity and like stronger conduction from the genitals, they're kind of a little they're still like a very sensitive system, but they're like not as powerfully in training or not as central as they're going to be. But I guess what I'm wondering is how to show up differently if at different ages you had different sensitivities or kinds of stimulation in terms of like the order of arrival. So like with like rats, I believe like Jim told me once that like you need like this anogenital licking of like the dam for the pup just to like kind of like have the nervous system wire up for it to like bootstrap itself into being like a healthy rodent. And if it doesn't get this,
that's right.
So like what happens if like, but what do the body maps look like? To what degree is that because you get misconfigured body maps? Or to what degree is this creating like a kind of nucleation of stability and salience that like gets like a feedback cycle with the body? Like, so it's like, what, like I can think of it like ecologically, like, okay, you want they smell, they have to get they have to get this all, they're communicating with each other, the dam and the pup, but like, I'm wondering like mechanistically, what exactly is it doing it?
It's a very interesting theoretical question about what happens if the mother fails to lick the pup's perineum. What happens to their representation of the genitals and the rectum? But the problem is that if she doesn't lick them, they die. So you wouldn't be able to do the follow-up study. So really, I mean, that's how important it is. I
didn't know they died. That's
yeah.
More than I thought.
Yes, no, they I mean, let me just sort of elaborate on what you just said.
I thought we just had a rodent model of autism. I didn't realize like they don't live.
Oh, that's yes, different. That is the urinary and defecatory reflexes in rodents, guinea pigs, rats. They don't develop on their own. The reflexes of emptying the bladder and emptying the rectum, they don't develop on their own but over the first few days, 5 days, the mother licks that region. The mother rat licks that, or guinea pig, they licks the region, and that stimulates their reflex to urinate or defecate. And she actually ingests both the urine and the feces, and she was demonstrated that she actually gets nutrition from that. She gets fluids because she's lactating. She gets fluids and also nutrients from the urine and the feces that is released.
I wonder if there's like an immunological commingling or confusion that actually helps her to see the pup maybe as part of self rather than other.
That's a question of whether an epigenetic effect can influence, if there's an epigenetic effect there that influences her behavior toward the pups. That's an empirical question. I don't think anybody's ever studied that. It's an interesting question. But without that stimulation that the mother gives to the pups, they die. That's how critical it is. But if she does it for about 5 days, and then they start doing, the reflexes develop, and they become autonomous, and so the pups can take care of themselves. They urinate and defecate on their own. They don't need the licking by the mother.
But this would be more like at the level of like spinal pattern generators, getting those coordinated.
Right.
But this will then like percolate into higher level body maps.
Of course. The sensation goes both ways.
The survival is basically natural selection assumed at the level of it's assumed this so much that this is like just even to get the low level reflexes to work, this has to be there. I wonder the extent to which that's potentially like a mechanism for concentrating resources on winning offspring. So it's like the runt of the litter or something like this. Whoever gets neglected, they all share genes, but you don't want, unfortunately, like I love the runts the most, but you don't want them to survive because they're not winning bets. You want to concentrate on the winners. And so it's like a post-birth gametes. It's a post-birth selection.
If they're too weak to get to the nipple, they don't get nutrition to begin with. Yeah, because
nature is beautiful and harsh.
That's right. I mean, there's competition with a large litter of 12 pups. It's a lot. They start growing. The weaker ones don't get. They literally get pushed out. They don't get to the nipple, and they don't survive. Yeah, so I mean, there are all kinds of selection mechanisms like that. So anyway, if I just to finish up this thing, this is why. So when the person's hand was amputated, the neurons coming up from down below, projecting to the face, sprout, and they connect with synapses to what the neurons that used to respond to the hand. So now, when the guy's face was tapped, he felt like his hand was being stimulated. Individual fingers were being stimulated. There was even a new map on the face that, depending on what part of the face was tapped, it felt like his thumb was being tapped or his pinky was being tapped, all after that hand was amputated. So it was all phantom, but it was even a systematic rearrangement, which means that there's a very systematic, there's tremendous systematic patterning in the nervous system.
I got a crazy idea. To what extent does the motor and the sensory, are they electrically coupled to enhance their coordination? So if they're actually having, by and large, this like common patterning and this common adjacency, to what extent do the evoked electrical fields, the population activity, allow them to coordinate better? Like, do they across like the central sulcus? Like, Can they
Well, I
act?
don't know if I don't know if
I
it's
don't know if that
necessarily
works.
electric. I don't know if it's necessarily electric, but it's certainly synaptic.
Based on the principle you're describing of economy and distance, I think
That's right.
we have a sufficient
And
explanation that we don't need to like invoke the electrical idea. But I'm wondering though,
yeah,
could
well,
it be though also electric?
it, uh,
Like gross motion on the side of motor helps to coordinate
yeah,
like,
no,
yeah.
it might be something. In fact, I've proposed that there's a uh, that it's just like fish producing turbulence in the water in an aquarium, um, that the electrical activity, which is movement of ions, because all the neurons are immersed in an ionic soup. And so when they fire, when they have action potentials, they perturb the water, the soup around them, the ionic soup around them, and that can spread. And because other neurons respond to the movement, it's actually
I'm wondering,
the
yeah.
yeah,
I'm wondering if
my
it's
photons.
particularly powerful at the level of the homunculi or the body maps because they're going to be so coherent in their
That's
activity
right.
because we
Yeah,
actually have a body. Like because like it's not like an abstraction or like
yeah.
like at that level I don't know if you ever get that much coherent synchronous activity as you would from like body motions. So I'm wondering if those are
Well,
particularly
I
likely to
think
involve the electrical coupling.
there is a principle of related systems being physically close to each other. That's a definite pattern. I mean, you mentioned, here in the case of the sensory and motor cortex, they're very, very closely aligned. So I mean, this is just one half of the brain. It's really, it's same thing as mirror image on the other side, and same thing with the sensory. So really, they're lined up right in the motor system is lined up right in front of the sensory system. The motor map, the motor homunculus, is lined up exactly in front of the sensory, and that you can't get much closer than that. And that is and through the corpus callosum, or through the connection between the sensory and the motor cortex. I mean, it's a direct connection, and that's the basis for a very close correlation between. It makes it very efficient because there's a question of speed of transmission through the brain, and the faster the transmission, the more efficient the transmission. So it's adaptive to have the sensory input and the motor output right next to each other.
It seems like we have like a sufficient explanation for intense coordination based on the principle you just described. And so I don't know if much would change whether or not there actually is this electrical field mediated enhancement of coherent activity.
Well, there's a
Because
term
it seems
for
like
it.
you could get it just from the distance principle, just
There-
from
there-
speed of conduction.
there's a term for it, and it's been demonstrated that it's true. The role of it's called, as opposed to synaptic transmission, which is the transmission from neuron A to neuron B through the synapse. The synapse is the connection between neuron A and neuron B, and that's how the A talks to B. Uh, and it's actually a one-way street, because B doesn't talk to A talks to B, and that's across the synapse. But uh, there's also a process and that's called synaptic transmission. There's also a process called ephaptic transmission. Ephaptic means that it's outside the synapse. It's communication between adjacent neurons. So you have a cable of neurons. So the neuron C is next to, let's say, A goes to B across the synapse, but neuron C is adjacent to neuron A, but not directly connected to. It's not synaptically connected. C is not synaptically connected to A. They're parallel. Parallel pathways in a cable. But when A is active, it sends out the kind of, in a way, it's electrical signals, because it's moving charge, moving ions, because the whole action potential mechanism is in and out movement of charged particles through the membrane, perpendicular to the membrane,
But
in
what
and
you're
out.
describing is so it is electrical coupling, but it is via the ionic soup.
Exactly.
And so that
Exactly. And that's called ephaptic
and
transmission.
So we know, and so Ephaptic coupling is well established. I'm wondering, has the
Ephaptic.
broader like population level like local field potentials?
Exactly.
Would that,
Yeah.
but would that also, is that also capable of creating like an entraining field?
Well,
like
I'm glad you asked me that question, because that's my hypothesis about production of consciousness. Because I mean, I don't want to get into that, but I mean, I just published a paper.
Oh, we will though.
Well, okay. I
We don't
published a
have to do it
paper.
today, but we will.
Okay. I published a paper with my student Heba Rahman on exactly that process. The idea is that the the reason for coming up with that idea of an overall electrical field, like the movement of water, like the turbulence of water in an aquarium produced by the swimming fish, that the swimming movements of the fish are extraordinarily complex. The turbulence, you look at the surface of the water and you see the waves, you see a pattern of a wave pattern of the undulating water on the surface. That is a precise representation based on physics. It's a precise,
it's a kind of holographic principle.
Well, it's more than a holographic principle, because while it's a precise product of this very complex swimming movements of the fish, when you look at it, it's a much simpler output.
So it's a dimensionality reduction.
It's a different level of right. It's a different dimension of representation. And my idea
like
is
higher
that
level harmonics among
it's
this like swirling
that's
flow,
a beautiful way of putting it. A higher level harmonic
projected onto this like reduced, like if you were able to see at the surface, like the harmonic principle, like in physics, like the information from a black hole being like represented on it's event horizon, it's like a 2D surface, but everything within there, the idea is it's like there, but the idea, or like the way like we see a movie, and the movie there's like a 2D frame, but the 2D is, we unpacked it as like a 3D world.
It looks like, yeah, it's the illusion of a 3D world.
And so here you're looking at this like this set of like waves on this reduced dimensionality surface, but underneath it you have basically all this swirling chaos.
Exactly.
Meaningful
So
chaos.
here's the reason I came to this idea, this concept of the moving ionic soup field, the electrical field that is represented by the perturbed ionic field, is like the analogy is with the movement of the ionic soup creating this electric field is equivalent to the water in the aquarium, and the neurons in the brain are equivalent to the fish in the aquarium. So because we have 100 billion neurons in the brain, and there's an estimate that many of the neurons have 1,000 inputs. Each neuron has 1,000 inputs. Laurenti de Noa, Rockefeller proposed that 1,000 inputs to a neuron. That means that there are trillions of synapses. And so this is an enormous computational process. Enormous, it's unfathomable. We can't comprehend the complexity of this activity.
Super astronomical combinatorics.
Super astronomical complexity. Talk about trillions of action potentials on 100 billion synapses.
So we need the fish to school.
We need the fish to school, but we need to have a simplification of that. So the the water on the top surface of the surface of the water is the simplification, because a baby trying to walk has to be simple. It has to be the brain activity, these trillions of synapse activity, this trillions of cells all active at the same time. This super complex computation has to be easy enough for a baby to use.
So both informationally, but also for establishing coherent force vectors at the effector systems. So it's like you're going to need
That's right.
basically this agreement among, like, so these fish could all go their own way, and actually more than the atom, many more than atoms in the universe, like numbers of combinations.
That's
but
right.
We need them to coordinate, both for the sake of knowing what's going on, to have a read on everything, but also for the sake of like shaping what's going on.
Now that what you just said is crucial to the idea of consciousness. I'll tell you why. Because, and that's what I think the clue to where consciousness is in the brain is that, for the very same reason that you just said, it's very close to the motor output, because the motor output is the simplification. The motor output is the undulation of the waves on the surface, on the top of the water in the aquarium. That's the motor output, because the motor output has to be very simple. You know, one step and then the next step. It has to be simple, but it has to be the consequence of this enormous complexity. So we have to understand, we have to be close to our motor output.
So a question about that.
So the consciousness, our understanding, our awareness has to be close to the relative simplicity of the motor output. And that's why I think that consciousness has to be somewhere close to the whatever controls the motor output.
So a question about that. So, or a few questions. And also, before I forget, later I want to talk to you about like the ratunculus and like what the homunculus of a rodent might be like, and how that, like, if you have a snout.
That's a very, there's a map of that. I can show you that. I can get the map of different animals.
Yeah.
I can do it of different animals.
Okay. Well,
and the snout.
Let's do
the
that.
Snout. Now, here's a
I derailed us. God.
No. A capsule idea is that in the rat, the face is enormous relative to the rest of the body. The paws are these little dots relative to the face. The whiskers, the snout, but in a cat, while the face, the snout is very large, the paws are very large. They're enormous. Or in the rat or the rabbit, the paws are very small compared to the face.
The systems of maximal affordance, of maximally powerful control and sensitivity,
precision,
and the body world of the animal.
And the precision, it's the idea of precision, because the more neurons there are, the more resolution and the finer the movements.
And so you're going to have some scaling of the maps and some scaling of basically the lived body, the consciousness of the body, for the sake of basically being a controller for regulating these action perception cycles and coupling with the world. You're going to want the maps to be changed, and some of these maps would actually would be the physical and computational realizers of consciousness as a lived body.
Okay.
Would that be the...
And if you look at the map in the brain, you can know a lot about the lifestyle of the organism, of the animal. You can tell a predator versus a prey animal based on just looking at the ratunculus or the catunculus or the homunculus.
Question: is it the case that, for instance, you're talking about like the proximity to the motor, but I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that it's actually like not frontal as much, but posterior cortices, or their posterior cortices have more of a driving role in action, like parietal cortex in like a rodent. It is in all animals, but in like it used to be more the case that the posterior lobes, like inferior parietal lobule, I don't know what that would be in a rodent, but like the idea of like that would have more of like a driving effect on spinal motor pools. I believe I might have read this recently. The reason I'm getting into that is so like, and some of the like suggestions I've been having that are along the lines, I think, of what you're saying, is that I'm wondering whether you have these like dual low dimensional schooling fish descriptions or population levels, one frontal and one posterior. So like and so like in a human, I'm wondering if like inferior parietal cortices might actually be this substrate of consciousness in the body, but then you're getting like maybe just on top of that another like coupling with it frontally, these other attractors which can do the job you're talking about. But I'm wondering if they're actually not the conscious ones, but it's actually the parietal. But I'm wondering though also whether these parietal ones, as we kind of go to our relatives that might look more like the core mammal from which we all evolved, whether for them the parietal is actually more motor than it is in us. Like our parietal cortices is more motor in a rodent versus a primate. That's the question. But
Yeah,
so,
I don't know. I don't know if that's been, I don't know of any study like that.
well, damn.
I understand what you're saying, but you know, there's so much we don't know. There's so much I don't know. Maybe it's known. You know, I tell my students that you know, I've been raised on the brainstem functions, you know, motivation, sex behavior, things like that. And but I've been dragged kicking and screaming into the cortex, not, you know, because it's become inevitable that I have to get into it. So, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm still learning a lot. There is known about the cortex. So, you know, I think maybe somebody else would be a better person, you know, specializing in cortical function.
We should talk about that later. There's some computational models of cortex that I think would
Yeah,
work well with I think they'd work well with everything you're saying.
yeah,
And I've been working on those recently, so
yeah,
we
I'd
should
love
talk about
to.
that.
I'd love to. That would be a great topic to get into maybe next time.
Yes,
Because
I can prepare a little bit on that. Yeah.
yeah, because I that's something that's beyond me. You know, so
I,
I'd like to learn that
I
from you.
basically like a lot of it, the models are kind of going back to Mount Castle and this idea of, and it has some relation with machine learning and trying to think of the idea of like a common, although different, but a common layer columnar architecture of cortex, suggesting potentially a common principle of like a common algorithm that's being deployed differently in this like hierarchy. So, but I think in the mindful brain with this was talked about with Edelman and Mountcastle, and Edelman actually kind of looping around was describing like a principle of neural Darwinism, I think, in that same collection. This idea of like the neurons have to be taken up into coherently functioning cell assemblies to release the neurotropic growth factors to just survive, to prevent like the pre-programmed cellular death, that they'll just be withered away. But the idea is like you start with this like mass of complexity, and you then like pick out like only those that could get taken up into
Oh yeah, I
coherently
mean
functioning groups.
that's a general principle of ontogeny on the development of the nervous system.
Yeah, you were
That
describing that earlier.
you start out with many more connections. You start out with a lot of potential connections, and then they get winnowed away, and there's apoptosis. That certain that means cell death.
Yeah.
Cell death. I don't know if it's suicide. They just they're
I
not.
think of it like a samurai doing harikari. It's like a noble like doing it.
Well,
Like
but you
I will
know,
clean up after myself nicely. Like
well, the cleanup comes after they start dying, but they start dying because they don't get input.
but it's better than necrosis though.
Right. Uh, a normal process of differentiation of function, that it starts out, in many cases starts out general with many potential connections, and then the less utilized connections start dying out because they don't have the input. And that's a normal process in development of the embryo and
But
into
body
the
maps will survive.
um,
And
body map.
your ability to couple with body maps will probably be pretty darn important for your ability to survive. It's like
Right.
everything should probably be structured by these body maps. It's like
Right. So it's probably, movement is probably important
everything.
for the development of the nervous system,
You would
because
expect
the
all the
movement,
circuits to be sculpted this way. Like,
yeah, because as the organism starts to move, it generates proprioceptive input, sensory input by its own movement, because there's a sensation of the muscles contracting and the sensation of the body moving in space and all that. So all that kinds of sensation of movement shapes it keeps survival of particular particular pathways. And that's, so if the body is moving in various ways, then that shapes the development of the body maps. Yeah. That's for sure.
and you're gonna have the strongest like schools of fish, the strongest populational activity there. It's like, so if you can't find a way of getting in, like of coupling with that, of aligning yourself with
Yeah.
those regimes, it seems you're going to be just like broken apart by chaos. Like this
Yeah.
will entrain everything else.
Yeah.
Like,
You need to have the motor system related adaptively to the sensory input, and vice versa. Yeah. So you need the communication between the motor and the sensory system, and the faster and more efficient it is. I mean, the closer the systems are to each other, the faster and more efficient are those connections, and the stronger they can become. Because if they're remote, then you lose that, probably neurons in between, or there's time, because it takes time for one neuron, for information from one neuron to travel to the next neuron. For example, here in this map, in the map, we're talking about the finger, and look at it. It's one neuron from the finger into the spinal cord. The same neuron travels all the way up the spinal cord, and the first connection to the next neuron is in the medulla at the very base of the brain. So it goes all the way from the finger all the way up to the base of the brain. That's one neuron. It can be, it could be 3 feet long.
why is it
But
crossing?
and it crosses off, it doesn't cross yet. It crosses after it gets to the medulla. This is in the touch system. But you just keep with that same, all the vertebrates have the same body plan. So that means that the same thing happens for the toe. So in the case of a basketball player, 7-foot tall basketball player, a neuron not from the finger but from the toe goes up the leg, into the spinal cord, up the spinal cord, and then synapses in the brain. That neuron could be 6 feet long. One cell could be 6 feet long. And to really get to the limit of that, think of a whale with a sensory neuron in the tail. The whale is 50 feet long. That one neuron.
What's the diameter of that thing?
Oh, I don't know in the case of the whale what the diameter is, but it's one neuron, 50 feet long. One cell, 50 feet long, because it's the same formula. It's the same. This formula is the same throughout all the vertebrates. This formula of where it takes 3 neurons to get to the sensory cortex.
It's a good thing we're made of jelly. Otherwise, I'd be really worried about that breaking.
Right. Imagine a person who's 100 years old, the cable connection from the body with going through all the head rotation, head and neck rotation, and jumping and falling, and all the
Or
movements
swimming.
that have been going on for 100 years. What human technology can we depend on for 100 years? I mean, we can't even depend on a damn tunnel or a bridge for 100 years.
But this
But
thing,
think
we're
of a
bending it, we're stretching it.
bending and stretching and flexing it, and it survives for 100 years and functions perfectly well. So
I had a
it's
question
really,
for you.
it's amazing.
How do you think the body maps would be different? Like we were talking before about, like, for instance, like people who like maybe hunt together, or like kind of like, and like are more like rhythmic ancestors who like would be more engaged in physical activity together of a mutually entraining variety. Like, to what degree, how weird are we relative to where we came from? Like, how would these body maps differently? Their ability just to be organized from within, or to like couple without? Like, are we all kind of, I don't know, like, I don't know if you'd call it like autistic or schizophrenic, but like relative to like our ancestors, like, are our body maps just much less coherent? And does having a coherent body map actually help you to come into like mutual entrainment with someone else? But that actually helps you to have more coherent body maps. Like, I guess what I'm wondering is, how broken are we as a species? But it could be a good thing. Like, maybe like it's freed us up to become like more like, abstract in our cognition.
I don't think it's a question of being broken. It's a question of how well do we adapt to whatever environment we're confronted with, because that's the same thing for all animals, all organisms. The question is not that they're broken, but I mean, if the environment changes, then you could say, like, now with climate change and global warming, we're not well enough adapted. I mean, a lot of the people now living are not well adapted. Say people in Alaska, or in the Eskimos in the Arctic Circle, are not well adapted to temperatures of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, same thing with polar bears. They were well adapted before. Now, maybe if there's too much fur, if some polar bears have too much fur, which was great when it was cold, now they can't dissipate the heat, and they don't survive.
There's trade-offs, and it's working relative to what context?
So exactly,
like what is adaptive and what niche are you trying to
so
occupy?
if we become like with Zoom and computers, we don't get up and have face-to-face meetings, and we just sit in front of our computer, then maybe our thumbs and our fingers will become maybe the representation of our sensory motor cortex for the fingers. People who I mean, it's a question of all kinds of different adaptation. How well are you adapted to whatever the situation is, and over many years, because it takes it takes time.
I can't disagree with what you're saying, but I still can't help but feeling like you talking about, like, for instance, like you and your partner like doing the experiment, and your heart's beating as one. Our ability to become like confused and to like become in sync with each other in these ways, like I do wonder, like, these as like helping us to have like basically empathy and like feelings of just like health in the body.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I'm wondering, like a Zoom species, maybe it's different adaptations, but I'm wondering if those are not like, we'll lose like a Zoom humanity is not a humanity we want.
Well, I'll tell you, here's an example of Darwinian selection at work. I really think this is, I mean, even more dramatic than what you're talking about, a Zoom society, which I'm thinking of a computer image, I mean, with a laptop and computer image that people are getting so used, they pay so much more attention to a two-dimensional world on the computer screens that they become worse drivers of cars because they don't have the time distance relationships. So I have noticed that over the years, and this is over, you know, only over a few decades, that over the years, drivers have, many more drivers are making a mistake of if I'm going along the main street and somebody's coming in on a side street, driving in on a side street, they're much more likely now than say 10 or 20 years ago to cut out right in front of me so that I have to slam on my brakes. And I'm sure there are fatalities based on that kind of lack of appreciation of time and distance. It may not just be that they're being rude and they think they can make it because they have more powerful cars and they can zoom out in front of me. But the fact that, let's say, if I'm not adapted to that and I'm slower on the draw, then they zoom out in front of me and I T-bone them and kill them.
Someone dies. Yeah.
Somebody dies.
I'm gonna take
because
this.
somebody dies because they've been spending too much time in a two-dimensional computer monitor, and they haven't been throwing footballs and playing catch and running and playing tag, and they don't have
and looking into each other's eyes,
three-dimensional experience
and mirroring with each other in real time in a rich way, but rather like just staring at a screen. Like,
right.
I'm going to take this a little further. I'm wondering the extent to which some of what's happened in recent decades in terms of like ideologies becoming more virulent and people, I don't know if they've always been, but I'm wondering if like the kind of generalization of this in terms of we're out of sync with each other more generally, and we're not actually fully real to each other. And so abstractions
I think that's
can be
very
more
true.
real than people. And I'm wondering if basically all sorts of basically failures of coordination, failures of empathy, because you don't actually feel people as real to you.
I think that the consequence,
heading for some really bad accidents, I feel.
A consequence, I think, is a lack of empathy, based on lack of physical interaction, leading to a lack of empathy, and that could have fatal consequences of, helping somebody in distress or ignoring them. I think that's I mean, just think of 100 years ago of people not moving, people living in this, growing up, living, marrying, and dying in the same 10-block area. And as opposed to now, where you get jobs in all different parts of the country, all different parts of the world, people don't tend to live where they grew up. They live someplace else, and that could have all kinds of consequences about empathy and whole social interaction, and that could really have effects on how we interact with different individuals. I mean, in some ways it could be hybrid vigor, improving, being more adaptive. In other ways, it could be less adaptive.
So like spiritual ligers.
And all these different factors. It's really hard
maybe sometimes, but I do wonder, like what you're just saying, like to grow up where you truly grew up together and you know them and they know you, like it might be really hard to like lie to people in those circumstances. It would be like there's almost like a mechanical trust, like you're forced to be trusting and trustworthy, because you're just not getting away with things.
That's right. Yeah, it has all those kinds of crazy implications,
but
and those could really have adaptive.
Spiritual liger.
Those could really have evolutionary significance.
Yeah, I'm wondering if like some changing
human nature.
some like spiritual leaders like are these like ligers where it's like because of this challenge they ended up going like even deeper into like what are the conditions where like you could have like, you know, me and you, I and thou, like we are present to each other, we are showing up like humans together for real. I'm wondering, yeah, so like you do get sometimes maybe like exceptional humanity from it. I'm just not seeing it by and large, but maybe that's just my own like negative point of view.
Well, but I think it's appropriately cynical.
Like,
By the way, I hate to bring this up, but it's 11:13.
yeah. So next time we have a lot to get into, ratunculi, your models of consciousness, and more.
Okay,
So,
ratunculi, monounculi, rabbit unculi. Yeah, well, different kinds of unculi.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, me too.
It's good to see you, Barry.
Good to see you, Adam. Have a good weekend and a good rest of the week.
Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.